Since the conquest of England by William the Conqueror in 1066 until the wars of the 19th century, France and its overseas neighbour across the Channel faced off for nearly 800 years. On the European continent, on the seas, or on the other side of the world, any pretext was good enough to reignite the flames of war. One of the major conflicts in this age-old rivalry is none other than the 100 Years' War, which would profoundly mark the end of the Middle Ages. The causes of this conflict are often reduced to a dynastic dispute between the Capuchin family, who rule in France, and the Angevin dynasty of the Plantagenets, who reign in England. However, the origins of the 100 Years' War are actually numerous and varied. Dynastic, territorial, or economic reasons for going to war were abundant in the early 14th century. Let's review the points of friction between the two kingdoms to understand what ignited the spark and caused this war that would last for 116 years. Vae Victis, a casus belli production.
If the 100 Years' War begins in 1337, the kings of France and England have been in opposition on multiple issues for several centuries. Let's go back a few centuries to get a complete view of the situation. At the end of the 12th century, the King of France ruled over a relatively extensive kingdom, but his royal domain, from which he derived his income, military power, and economic strength, was very limited. Barons like the Duke of Burgundy, the Count of Champagne, but especially the Duke of Aquitaine, were more powerful than him. Let's focus on the case of the Duke of Aquitaine. After the death of the English king Henry Beauclerc in 1135, the last son of William the Conqueror, his daughter Matilda the Empress was designated to succeed him to the English throne. However, this was not to the liking of the clergy and some barons, who organized a revolt to have Stephen of Blois, the nephew of the late king, ascend to the throne. This led to a long civil war that ended in an agreement between the warring parties. Stephen of Blois retained his throne until his death, and thereafter the descendants of Matilda would ascend to the throne. Matilda's son, Henry Plantagenet, who was the Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, Maine, and Touraine, thus became the designated successor to the English throne. At this juncture, Eleanor of Aquitaine, the wife of the King of France, Louis VII, was repudiated in 1152. Several theories divide historians on the cause of the separation of the royal couple, but the main one suggests Eleanor's infidelity during the Second Crusade. She allegedly had relations with her uncle, Raymond of Poitiers, Prince of Antioch. The King of France, humiliated before his court and knights, made the rupture inevitable. The degree of consanguinity, cousins at the 4th and 5th degrees, between the two spouses was highlighted to justify the annulment of the marriage. Less than 2 months later, she remarried Henry Plantagenet, who was 10 years younger and had the same degree of consanguinity. Eleanor brought the Duchy of Aquitaine as her dowry, adding to his already numerous continental possessions. When Henry finally ascends to the throne of England in 1154, he is at the head of a true empire that stretches from the Pyrenees to the Scottish border. Furthermore, Henry takes control of the Duchy of Brittany. In 1166, he forces Duke Conan IV to abdicate in favor of his 5-year-old daughter Constance. Power thus entirely passes into the hands of Henry Plantagenet, who betroths the little girl to his 8-year-old son. Geoffrey and Constance will marry 15 years later, and Brittany will definitively fall under the influence of the Plantagenet family. We are thus facing a complex situation. The King of France has a king as his vassal. Indeed, the Duke of Aquitaine was a king, but the king in Aquitaine was the King of France, not the King of England. Therefore, when in England, Henry II is equal to the King of France, but he is his vassal and owes him loyalty and homage when it comes to his continental possessions. To this intricate feudal situation is added the fact that the possessions of the Plantagenet in the Kingdom of France are such that his domain is much richer and more important than that of the King of France. A particular king, Philip Augustus, will seek to weaken this cumbersome neighbor and will gradually succeed in nibbling away at his territory. At the end of his reign, the royal domain of the King of France has multiplied by 5 and includes Normandy, Anjou, and, above all, the Plantagenet possessions on the continent are now limited to the Duchy of Guyenne, a coastal strip about 100 kilometers wide from Bordeaux to Biarritz. The King of France is finally the most powerful lord in his kingdom.
Duchy of Guyenne
Will subsequently be used as a lever by the King of France to submit the King of England. Indeed, in case of failure to fulfill vassal obligations, non-compliance with the rendered homage, perjury, or conspiracy, the King of France could confiscate the duchy, which, despite its reduced size, remained the richest region of the Plantagenet Empire, notably due to its significant wine production. The kings of France will resort to confiscation multiple times in the decades preceding the beginning of the 100 Years' War, humiliating the King of England each time and temporarily depriving him of the fiscal revenues of his duchy.
On top of this territorial rivalry came an unprecedented succession crisis in the Kingdom of France. Since the accession of Hugh Capet, founder of the Capetian dynasty, the French king had always had a son to succeed him. Historians refer to this as the Capetian miracle. The Capetian monarchy was originally elective, but the principle of hereditary succession gradually became customary. After Philip Augustus, French kings were no longer crowned during their father's lifetime. All that remained of the elective principle was the acclamation of the king by the realm's great lords during his coronation. In the early 14th century, the King of France was Philip the Fair, Philip IV. He had 3 sons, Louis X, called the Quarrelsome, Philip V, called the Tall, and Charles IV, called the Fair, and 1 daughter, Isabella. The succession of the Iron King seemed assured. Louis X was married to Margaret of Burgundy, and, at the time, had only 1 daughter, Joan. Then, a royal scandal erupted, known to history as the affair of the Tour de Nesle. The 3 daughters-in-law of the king were caught in the act of adultery. Neglected by their husbands, Princesses Margaret of Burgundy and Blanche of Artois, wife of Charles IV, had taken 2 young squires as lovers. The 3rd princess, Joan of Artois, wife of Philip V, was not directly involved, but was aware of the affairs of her sister and sister-in-law. On the orders of King Philip the Fair, the 2 squires were arrested, quickly tried and executed. The 2 adulterous princesses were also imprisoned. Margaret of Burgundy died from the cold in her prison at Château Gaillard, and Blanche of Artois served 10 years before ending her life in a convent. Joan of Artois, though uninvolved directly, took some time to clear her name. This was a major blow to the Capetian dynastic succession. Louis X, the future king of France, had no wife and no male heir. After Philip the Fair's death on November 29, 1314, Louis X ascended to the throne, but died only 18 months later, leaving the new queen, Clementia of Hungary, pregnant. For the first time in nearly 350 years, doubt hung over the French succession. If the queen gave birth to a boy, he would be king from birth, with his uncle, Philip the Tall, acting as regent until his majority. However, nothing was planned in the event of a daughter. After months of waiting, the queen finally gave birth in November 1316. And, miracle, it was a boy. The Capetian dynasty was saved. Sadly, the newborn John I died after only a few days, to the great shock of the people who suspected foul play by certain princes who stood to gain. Philip the Tall declared to his uncle Charles of Valois and his brother Charles the Fair that he was the most rightful heir to the kingdom. Joan, a child and daughter of an adulterous queen, could not challenge her uncle Philip, whose intelligence and valor in battle were recognized by the barons. Philip V declared himself king with the approval of the great lords of the realm in late November, and was crowned at Reims Cathedral on January 9, 1317. Joan was excluded not only from the throne of France, but also from that of Navarre and the county of Champagne, in exchange for a pension of 15,000 livres. The principle of male-only succession, introduced by Philippe the Fair for the transmission of appanages, was now being applied to the French crown. This new rule was so well accepted that when King Philip V died in 1322, his brother Charles IV the Fair, the last son of Philip the Fair, took the throne. No one considered giving the crown to one of Philip V's 4 daughters. Like his brothers, Charles IV had a short reign. 6 years after taking the throne, he died without a male heir, thus ending the infamous episode of the Cursed Kings. As often happens, history repeated itself. When Charles IV died on February 1st, 1328, his wife was 7 months pregnant. This time, however, the king had planned for the eventuality. If the queen gave birth to a son, he would be king under the regency of Philip of Valois, the king's cousin. If it was a girl, the peers of France and great barons would choose a new king based on who had the best claim. Thus, the French monarchy returned to its elective roots, as it had been in the early Capetian days. Already regent while awaiting the birth of the child, who turned out to be a girl, Philip of Valois positioned himself as the only viable option for the great barons, who held him in high esteem. He was the closest male relative of the deceased king, a grown man with a reputation for wisdom and knightly courage. During the deliberations, however, some jurists proposed another candidate, Edward III of England. He was not only the grandson of Philip the Fair, but also a male line descendant, whereas Philip of Valois was merely a nephew. Edward's claim was quickly dismissed. If women were excluded from inheriting the crown, how could Edward derive his right through his mother, Isabella? Yet the real reason for rejecting Edward's claim lay elsewhere. The French barons did not want a foreign prince, grandson of France or not. It didn't matter that he belonged to a French dynasty and spoke French as his mother tongue. Moreover, the barons were wary of a powerful king who might curtail their independence, exactly what could happen if the crowns of France and England were united. Edward III and his few supporters harbored no illusions. The barons wanted a native king. Edward lacked the means to oppose their decision and had to accept it. Though not the immediate cause of the war, the newly established male-only succession law would later serve as England's justification for war. Philip of Valois was thus chosen by the French baron to succeed his cousin. However, the barons' support came at a price. Many of them negotiated in exchange for land, money, and also military intervention in Flanders to crush a new revolt. He was crowned in Reims on May 29, 1328, and took the name Philip VI. Edward III was absent from the coronation, but after months of hesitation, he eventually came to France to pay homage to Philip VI for the Duchy of Guyenne. All the great figures of the kingdom were present to witness the homage. It was, at once, a display of honor toward Edward III, but also a calculated reminder of his inferiority, with no shortage of witnesses. Negotiations continued in the years that followed between the kings of France and England, regarding the borders of Guyenne and the return of castles confiscated by the French crown. Several times, war seemed imminent, but neither king truly wanted open conflict. A lasting peace even seemed close at one point. However, external conflicts began to disrupt relations between the two rivals. Indeed, under the terms of the Old Alliance, France made it a precondition for peace with England that England also make peace with Scotland, which had launched its Second War of Independence. Having first gained independence under the rule of Robert the Bruce, Scotland once again had to face English attacks. The armies of this rebellious independent Scotland had defeated English forces several times and were threatening England's security. England managed to reverse the tide by defeating David Bruce's army, he was still a child at the time, at the Battle of Halidon Hill in 1333. An English-aligned Scottish pretender was then installed on the throne. After this defeat, David Bruce and his entourage fled to France and were given refuge at Château Gaillard. French and Scottish representatives met multiple times to decide how to regain the upper hand in the Scottish conflict. To Edward III, who could not tolerate interference in what he considered his sphere of influence, things were clear. Philip VI was acting as an enemy of England. From that moment on, the hostility between the two cousins would only grow. On another front, the Flemish question was also a major source of tension between the French and English. This prosperous region of the Kingdom of France had developed a renowned and high-quality cloth industry. The Flemish bourgeoisie of major cities, burdened by the taxes imposed by the Count and the King, often revolted. The French nobility still remembered the Matins of Bruges and the Battle of Courtrai, where the French chivalry had suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of Flemish foot soldiers. Although the insult had been avenged and the revolt crushed after the victory at Mons-en-Pévèle, Flemish burghers still resisted royal authority. The poor harvests of 1315 and the new tax increases imposed by the new Count of Flanders, Louis of Nevers, sparked renewed revolts in cities like Bruges and Ypres. Ghent, siding with the Count, triggered a civil war in the region. Seeing that he could not quell the unrest alone, the Count of Flanders asked his liege lord, King Philip VI, for assistance during the homage ceremony. The new King of France, Philip VI, saw in this an opportunity to assert his authority over the barons while strengthening his power. The king took up the royal oriflamme at Saint-Denis and marched toward Flanders. Meanwhile, the people of Ghent attacked Bruges, forcing the city to dedicate most of its insurgent forces to its defense. The rest of the rebels entrenched themselves on the heights of Mount Cassel, awaiting the French host. The insurgents were crushed by the royal army, and Philip VI, fighting on the front lines, proved his valor, further consolidating his position on the throne and legitimizing his reign in the eyes of the barons and the populace. This reassertion of French control over the county alarmed the English, especially as they were the main exporters of wool to Flanders. However, Flanders' status as a hub of European trade began to decline in the early 14th century due to excessive regulation and an unwillingness to adopt new technologies. The invention of the compass and rudder and the increase in ship tonnage allowed Italian merchants to trade directly with England without passing through Flanders. Workshops began producing their own cloth, contributing further to the ruin of parts of the Flemish bourgeoisie. New, shorter trade routes via Germany also reduced merchant traffic through France. The Champagne fairs, Troyes, Provins, Bar-sur-Aube, and Lagny-sur-Marne, once an economic heart of the kingdom, saw their activity drop by 75% within a few years. New trade routes were emerging, but France, sclerotic and backward-looking, failed to realize this, or to match the development of its neighbors, who were already building maritime fleets. France's lack of a fleet would prove a severe handicap in the centuries to come. Thus began a period of recession in Philip VI's kingdom. The industrial economy was not the only one suffering in the early 14th century. A seigneurial crisis also afflicted landowning nobles. Peasants were required to pay a fee to their lord to work the land. However, the amount of this tax, set more than 200 years earlier, had not been adjusted for inflation. As a result, land income had decreased by 2/3 between the 12th and 14th centuries. This decline in revenue was further worsened by the rotten harvest of 1315 to 1317. The severe famines that followed led to a population decrease and thus a shortage of labor. This caused wages to rise and, therefore, a further decline in income for landowners. As a result, many nobles began to abandon their landholdings and turn toward a much more lucrative activity: war. Everything seemed to be lining up for a major confrontation. Robert of Artois, one of the great barons of the kingdom, would serve as a catalyst for this conflict. He was involved in his own succession dispute and felt cheated, appealing to the king to resolve the issue. Upon the death of his grandfather, the county of Artois passed to his aunt Mahout, since Robert's father had already died. Under feudal law, lands passed to the last living child of the deceased. No one thought to give the county to a 15-year-old boy with little influence. For years, Robert cried foul and sought redress at every opportunity. However, with the accession of Philip VI, the principle of male primacy in succession had now taken hold. In 1329, upon Mahaut's death, Robert again asked the king to settle the matter in his favour. But he was not the only one eyeing the county. Other powerful barons were also interested. The matter was brought before the court in 1330, and when the clerks of parliament examined the documents submitted by Robert of Artois to support his claim, shock! They were forgeries, and crude ones at that. Robert of Artois was immediately dismissed, but now had to face a much graver accusation, lèse-majesté, a crime against the sovereign. By producing forged documents, he had overstepped a royal prerogative, and the king had no choice but to act. Jeanne de Divion, the forger, was burned at the stake on October 6, 1331. Anticipating the sentence of banishment issued on April 6, 1332, Robert of Artois fled. He travelled through southern France and Belgium, before taking refuge with someone who hated the King of France as much as he did, Edward III of England. Across the Channel, Robert of Artois tirelessly stoked Edward III's ambitions, repeating that he was the most direct and therefore most legitimate heir to the French crown. Gradually, all the pieces on the chessboard began to fall into place. Surrounded by a veritable nest of vipers, Edward III decided to safeguard his own crown by redirecting his barons' thirst for conflict toward a new enemy, Philip VI of France. While the true bone of contention between the two monarchs was Guyenne, the French support for the Scots, and the dynastic disputes were put forward as justifications for launching the conflict. Edward III secured funding from his parliament to wage war, and, fearing a French invasion of his island, began assembling a fleet to take the war to the continent. On his side, Philip VI had no objection to war. He saw it as a way to replenish the kingdom's coffers and to definitively assert his legitimacy. To try to isolate the King of France, Edward III imposed a ban in late 1336 on all wool exports to Flanders and all cloth imports into England, in an effort to pressure the cloth-producing cities to side with the English. He also offered generous privileges to foreign craftsmen willing to settle in English towns, pushing the Flemings further into rebellion against the King of France. Edward III's actions prompted Philip VI to accuse him of treason and to confiscate the Duchy of Guyenne. In response, Edward III sent the Bishop of Lincoln to Paris at the end of 1337 to cast down his gauntlet before Philip of Valois, who claims to be King of France. Homage was broken and war was declared. It would last 116 years. To learn more about the first clashes of the 100 Years' War, tune in to the next episode.